What Ranger found on Harmon Ridge. The wind came in long, low waves across the Montana plains, carrying snow that didn't fall so much as drift sideways, scraping along the asphalt in pale sheets that made the empty highway look like something dissolving. The sky had turned the color of old iron hours ago and hadn't changed since. Out here, past the last gas station, past the last blinking traffic light, past everything that still had a name or a purpose, the world felt stripped down to its essential parts: cold, wind, silence, and the occasional creak of a battered pickup truck sitting alone in a gravel lot beside a station that hadn't sold a gallon of fuel in at least 2 winters. The truck was faded blue, or had been once. Now it was closer to the color of the sky above it. Rust had claimed the lower edges of both doors and crept along the wheel wells with the patient determination of something that had all the time in the world. One headlight worked perfectly. The other flickered every few seconds as if struggling to stay interested. Inside the truck, the engine idled low. Claire Harmon sat with both hands resting in her lap, not on the wheel. She wasn't going anywhere. She had nowhere left to go, and at some point in the last hour, she had stopped pretending otherwise. She was 32 years old, though the last 3 months had done something to her that felt closer to 10 years. Her dark hair was cut short in the practical style she'd kept since her first year in the Navy, slightly grown out now at the edges, no longer regulation, but not yet anything else. Her jaw was strong and angular, the kind of face that looked carved rather than made, and her eyes were gray, the deep gray of open water on an overcast afternoon. A small scar ran along the left side of her chin, thin and pale, a souvenir from a training drill aboard a destroyer that no one ever talked about afterward. Her shoulders were broad, her posture automatic. 12 years of naval service didn't leave a person when the paperwork was signed. It stayed in the spine. It stayed in the way the eyes moved across a room, checking corners, measuring distances. It stayed even when there was nothing left to measure. She had been out of the Navy for exactly 93 days. In that time, she had lost one job when the company's contract fell through, lost a second when the foreman decided he didn't need the extra hand after all, spent more nights in this truck than she'd spent in any bed, and watched the small reserve of savings she'd built over 12 careful years disappear faster than she had believed possible. The heater worked at least. That much was still true. Beside her, filling the entire passenger seat, and then some, was Ranger. The dog was 5 years old and built like something designed for a purpose and then refined over years of actual use. A German Shepherd black across the back and saddle warming to a deep tan along his chest and legs. His coat was thick, well kept despite everything, and his ears stood straight with the kind of permanent alertness that never fully switched off even during sleep. One ear had a slight crook at the very tip, the result of a minor injury during his early training that had healed imperfectly and remained ever since, giving him a look of perpetual curiosity that didn't match the sharpness in his amber eyes at all. His left rear leg carried an old joint injury, minor enough not to slow him, but present enough that he had learned to compensate landing with a practiced ease that distributed the impact across the rest of his body. Those eyes were always watching, always processing. Ranger had spent 3 years assigned to a naval security unit stationed at a port facility on the Pacific coast. He had been trained to detect unauthorized entry, identify explosives, and respond to movement with precision that most human beings spent careers trying to develop. He had worked alongside several handlers before Claire, but she was the one who had stayed. She was the one who, when the unit was reassigned and Ranger was flagged for retirement due to that joint condition, had filed the paperwork to adopt him before anyone else could suggest another option. He was not a pet. He was a partner. There was a difference, and both of them understood it without needing to say so. Ranger had his chin resting on Claire's right arm, now his amber eyes half closed but not fully, watching the dark beyond the windshield, listening to the wind work against the glass. Claire stared at the empty road. She had driven to Montana because the previous state had run out of possibilities, and Montana had seemed in that moment of desperation like a direction. Not a plan, just a direction. The truck had gas enough to get here and not much beyond that. The account had enough left for maybe 5 days of food. After that, the options narrowed to something she didn't want to think about directly. Ranger shifted beside her and exhaled a slow, warm sound. "Yeah," Claire said quietly. "I know." She had learned over the years that talking to him wasn't the same as talking to yourself, Ranger responded, not with words obviously, but with weight shifts and ear positions and the quality of his attention. He was listening to her now the same way he listened to everything. Completely. She looked out at the gravel lot, the dark highway, the absolute nothing in every direction. Then she saw it. The windshield wiper on the driver's side. Something white was tucked beneath it. An envelope pressed flat against the glass, its edges fluttering slightly in the wind that had found its way under the truck's frame. Claire frowned. She had been sitting here for at least 40 minutes. She hadn't seen anyone. There were no other cars in the lot, no buildings close enough to have hidden someone approaching, no tracks in the gravel that she could make out through the windshield. She opened the door and the cold hit her immediately, that specific Montana cold that felt personal, like it had been waiting for her specifically. She pulled the envelope free and climbed back in, pulling the door shut against the wind. Ranger lifted his head. His nose moved. The envelope was thick paper, the kind that cost money. A law firm's letterhead was printed in the upper left corner. Donnelly and Hearst Attorneys at Law, Red Creek, Montana. Claire tore it open. Inside was a folded document in a short note written by hand, the letters careful and unhurried. She read it twice. The note said that she was the named beneficiary in the estate of one Earl Harmon, her father's older brother, who had passed away 6 weeks prior. The property in question was a working ranch located outside the town of Red Creek, Montana, a place called Harmon Ridge Ranch. According to the document, with no direct descendants, Earl had designated Claire as sole inheritor of the land, the structures, and all contents therein. She read it a third time. Earl Harmon. She had met him exactly once 20 years ago at a family gathering she mostly remembered as long and uncomfortable. She recalled a tall man, quiet in the way that certain people are quiet when they've decided that most conversations aren't worth the effort. Weathered skin, eyes that moved slowly but missed nothing. He had shaken her hand firmly, looked at her for a moment as if checking something, and then moved on. That was it. That was the entirety of what she knew about Earl Harmon, and somehow he had known she was here. In this lot, on this night. The letter had no postmark, no stamp, no indication of any postal service whatsoever. Someone had placed this envelope directly on her truck. Claire sat with that for a long moment. The wind pressed against the windows. Ranger was watching her now, ears fully upright. Apparently, she said slowly, we just inherited a ranch. The dog's tail moved once against the seat. She looked down at the address printed on the document. Then she looked at the dark highway. She had nowhere else to be. The drive to Harmon Ridge took her through 40 minutes of country that grew steadily emptier as she went. The paved road gave way to gravel, and the gravel gave way to a dirt track that cut across open grassland like a thin scar on pale skin. The headlights caught dry sagebrush in fence posts and the occasional shape of something watching from the dark beyond the beams, gone before she could name it. Ranger sat upright in the passenger seat for the entire drive, watching the land scroll past with the focused attention of something being cataloged. The ranch appeared at the top of a low rise, 3 structures arranged close together as if for warmth. A farmhouse that leaned very slightly to the east, its paint stripped by years of wind down to bare gray wood. A long barn with several wall panels hanging loose, moving softly in the gusts. A sheep pen enclosed by fence posts that had developed various opinions about their own vertical alignment. No lights, no smoke from the chimney, no sign that anything living had been here recently. Claire stopped the truck and sat looking at it for a moment. Well, she said. Ranger was already at the door. She let him out, and he hit the frozen ground lightly, his bad leg taking the impact with practiced compensation, and immediately began a systematic sweep of the yard. Nose low-moving in careful arcs, cataloging the property the way he had been trained to assess new environments. Claire walked to the farmhouse first. The door was unlocked. Inside, the air smelled of old wood and cold, and something faintly medicinal, like salve or liniment used for many years, and now simply absorbed into the walls. The furniture was sparse and functional. A table, 2 chairs, a wood stove, a narrow bed in the back room, shelves with a small collection of books, mostly field guides, and a few older novels with spines broken from being opened so many times. A photograph on the wall above the table, black and white, showing the ranch as it might have looked decades ago, a man standing in front of the barn with what appeared to be 200 sheep behind him. Claire stood in the middle of the room for a moment. It was cold. It was worn. The floor creaked under her boots, and the wind found the gaps in the window frames without any trouble. But it had walls and a roof and a wood stove, and after 93 days it felt against her better judgment, like something almost adequate. She found firewood stacked under an oilcloth on the side porch and got the stove going. Ranger came inside and settled near the heat, watching the room from his position, with the economy of an animal who knows how to rest without ever fully letting his attention go. Outside, the Montana night pressed in against the glass. Claire sat at the table with the documents spread in front of her, reading them again in the firelight. The ranch was hers, free and clear, paid off decades ago according to the legal language. No liens, no outstanding obligations. Just land, a house, a barn, a sheep pen with no sheep. She could sell it. That was the obvious move. Take whatever it brought, put it toward a fresh start, somewhere that wasn't a cold gravel lot in the middle of nothing. She knew almost nothing about ranching. She knew ships. She knew security protocols. She knew how to stay awake for 36 hours and still make clean decisions under pressure. Sheep were outside her operational experience. Sell it, she thought. Get whatever you can get. Move on. It was a reasonable plan. She fell asleep in the chair with Ranger's head on her foot and the fire ticking softly in the stove. The next morning arrived gray and sharp, the sky the color of old pewter, the wind still present and opinionated. Claire was up before dawn, out of habit, a habit 12 years deep, and she had already started working on the most immediately dangerous of the broken fence posts by the time the light had fully established itself across the plains. It was physical work, and she welcomed it. Her mind was quieter when her hands were busy. She had learned that about herself early in her service, and it hadn't changed since leaving it. Ranger moved around the yard in long, easy circles, investigating the various outbuildings, revisiting the barn twice with the careful repetition of an animal that doesn't trust a first impression. But his interest kept returning to one direction. The hill, the low ridge that rose behind the barn to the west, covered in dry winter grass that bent and recovered in continuous waves with the wind. He would stop whatever he was doing and stand looking at that hill, ears high, tail level, the focused stillness that she recognized from training, from exercises, from the real moments that came after training, when the calm wasn't practiced anymore but actual. "What's up there?" she said, not really expecting an answer. He looked at the hill, then at her, then at the hill again. She told herself it was a coyote, maybe a deer, the instincts of a working dog finding something to apply themselves to in a new environment. She went back to the fence post. She heard the engine before she saw the vehicle, a low, expensive hum, the kind that comes from something with a good motor and regular maintenance. She straightened and turned toward the access road. A black SUV came over the rise and moved toward the ranch with the smooth, unhurried certainty of something that knew exactly where it was going and felt entirely comfortable getting there. It was a vehicle that cost more than the truck Claire was sleeping in by a significant margin. It looked like it had been washed that morning. It stopped near the gate. The driver's door opened. The man who stepped out was perhaps 50, perhaps a few years either side. Tall, with the kind of posture that came from choosing to stand straight rather than being built that way. His hair was dark at the roots and silver at the temples, trimmed with precision. He wore a dark wool coat over a button-down shirt, and his shoes, which were immediately picking up the fine dust of the ranch yard, had clearly started the morning with the mirror finish. He carried himself with the ease of someone accustomed to walking into situations and having them reorganize around him. His name, as he introduced himself while extending a hand with a practiced smile, was Victor Langston. "Morning," he said pleasantly. "You must be Claire Harmon." She shook his hand once. "That's right." Between them, without any dramatic announcement, Ranger materialized. He had come around the corner of the barn and now stood precisely between Claire and the man, close enough to her right side that she could feel the warmth of him. He made no sudden movements. He didn't bark. He simply stood, and a low sound came from somewhere in his chest, continuous and measured like a machine operating at the edge of its tolerance. Langston noticed. He kept his expression easy. Beautiful animal. He used to work for the Navy. Ah, Langston took this in. That explains the instincts. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and produced a thin leather folder, which he opened with the efficiency of a man who had opened many such folders in many such conversations. He explained without rushing that he represented a regional development consortium, that the consortium was in the process of evaluating land in this corridor of the state for a future project, that they had identified the Harmon Ridge property as falling within their area of interest. He was pleasant about all of it, organized, every sentence placed where it needed to go. Then he named the number, $22,000. He said it the way someone says a number they consider more than fair watching to see if the reaction confirms it. Claire looked at the folder, at the clean paper inside it, at the number printed there. $22,000 was more money than she had. It was also less money by a factor she couldn't calculate standing in a cold ranch yard with an empty stomach than whatever this land was actually worth to someone who had driven a vehicle like that out here to offer it. "You knew my uncle?" she asked. Something shifted in Langston's expression, barely the way a calculation adjusts. "Not personally, but the property has been on our radar for some time." "How long?" "Several years," he said it smoothly. Ranger had not moved. The sound in his chest had not stopped. Claire handed the folder back. "I just got here yesterday. I'm not ready to make any decisions." Langston received the folder with a nod that communicated understanding and patience and the absolute certainty that he would be returning. He left a card on the fence post with the same practiced ease he'd brought to everything else. Walked back to the SUV, got in, drove away without visible frustration. Claire watched the dust settle behind him. She looked down at Ranger. The dog was still watching the road long after the sound of the engine had faded into the distance. "You didn't like him," she said. Ranger turned and looked at her once, then turned back to the road. She drove into Red Creek that afternoon for supplies. The town was modest in the extreme. A gas station, a general store, a feed supply warehouse that appeared to operate on variable hours, and a narrow diner at the main corner where the two roads that actually mattered intersected. Inside the diner, the air was warm and smelled of coffee and something fried in butter. And that combination after the cold and the wind and the relentless gray of the morning was almost startling in how welcome it was. Claire took a stool at the counter. She ordered coffee and did not look at the food menu because she already knew what the coffee cost and she was calculating. 2 stools away sat an older man. He was perhaps 72, perhaps older, the kind of face that had absorbed so many years of Montana weather that the weather was now part of his expression. A gray mustache, thick and carefully kept, covered most of his upper lip. He wore a flannel shirt under a canvas work jacket and a cowboy hat that had earned its battered condition across what appeared to be several decades. He was nursing a cup of coffee and looking at nothing in particular through the window beside him, but Claire had been trained to recognize the difference between a person looking at nothing and a person who was watching everything while appearing to look at nothing. This man was the second kind. He spoke without turning his head. "You're Earl Harmon's niece." It wasn't a question. Claire set down her cup. "How did you know that?" "Truck out front," he said. "Earl described it to me 2 months back. Said if a woman showed up in a beat-up blue Ford with a German Shepherd riding shotgun, I should make sure she got this." He reached into his jacket pocket and set a small sealed envelope on the counter between them. "Lawyer already sent the main letter. Earl wanted me to handle this one personally." He turned then, and his eyes were the steady blue of someone who has spent a long time looking at open country. "Amos Pruitt." "Claire Harmon. I know who you are." He nodded at the envelope. "He asked me to wait until you'd been to the ranch first. Wanted you to see it before you read that." Claire opened it. Inside a single index card in Earl's careful hand. 4 words don't sell. "Trust the dog." She set it down slowly. "You mind if I ask you something?" she said. "Go ahead." "The man who came to see me this morning, Victor Langston, you know him?" Amos Pruitt was quiet for a moment. He drank his coffee slowly. Outside, a gust moved down the main road and pushed a thin curtain of snow dust across the window. "Third time," he said finally. Claire waited. First time he was calling himself something to do with energy. Infrastructure development, I think. Different name on the card. That was about 4 years back. Amos set his cup down carefully. Earl sent him off. Didn't take long. Second time he had a different company name. Different pitch, about 2.5 years ago. Earl sent him off again. He paused. Same man both times. Same smile. Claire felt something tighten in her chest. Not fear exactly. Something more like the feeling before a watch change on a rough night when the weather hasn't arrived yet, but the instruments are already telling you it's coming. Why does he want that land so badly? Amos looked at her sideways. That's the right question. He picked up his hat and set it back on his head at the same angle it had been. Earl knew. He never told me all of it, but I know he knew. He stood and set money on the counter for his coffee. Whatever's under that ridge, Miss Harmon, it's worth a lot more than what that man offered you. He buttoned his coat, and Earl spent the last 10 years making sure the wrong people never got to it. He walked out without looking back. Claire sat with her coffee and the weight of what she'd just heard, and outside the diner window, the wind moved down the empty street and the sky pressed lower, and the light began its early Montana retreat toward the edge of the plains. She drove back to the ranch in the fading afternoon. Ranger riding with his nose directed at the crack in the window she always left for him, pulling information from the passing air with that steady, unsentimental focus that she had spent years learning to trust completely. She made soup from what she'd bought in town and ate it at Earl's table in Earl's chair in the wavering light of the wood stove surrounded by the quiet accumulation of a man's long, solitary life. The field guides on the shelf, the single photograph on the wall, the way the two chairs were arranged as if the second one was kept out of habit rather than expectation. She thought about Earl, about the fact that she barely remembered him, about the fact that he had planned all of this carefully enough to brief Amos Pruitt to time the delivery of a handwritten card to describe her truck from memory 2 months before he passed. She thought about Langston and his 3 visits under 3 different names. She thought about the index card. Don't sell. Trust the dog. The stove ticked. The wind found the window frames. Ranger was stretched near the fire, but his eyes weren't fully closed, and his ears moved occasionally with the small sounds of the ranch settling into the cold of deep night. Then just past midnight, they stopped moving. He raised his head. His ears came fully upright in the single precise motion of an animal that has found what it's been listening for. He stood, his nose pointed toward the door, and then he walked to it and pressed one paw against the wood once deliberate. Claire was already on her feet. She pulled her coat over her shoulders and her boots on without lacing them, and opened the door, and the cold came in immediately and completely, and Ranger was already moving across the yard, dark against the snow, heading directly for the barn. The night was clear now, the storm having shifted, and the stars over Montana were extravagant and relentless in how bright they were. The frozen ground crackled under Claire's boots as she crossed the yard. The barn door was slightly open, which she was certain she hadn't left it, and Ranger slipped through without breaking stride. Inside, the cold was sharp and dense, the air smelling of old hay and wood dust and time. The wind found the loose panels and made them speak in irregular rhythms. Claire had a small flashlight in her coat pocket, a habit from 12 years of night watches, and she clicked it on and followed the sound of Ranger's movements. He was at the far end of the barn. There were several stalls along the left wall, all empty, their gates open and listing on their hinges. Broken tools leaned against the far wall. The remnants of old hay lay scattered across the dirt floor in patterns that suggested years of settling and wind. Claire's light moved across all of it without finding anything that explained the dog's behavior. Ranger was standing in front of a support pillar. It was one of 4 large vertical beams that held the barn's roof structure in place, thick and dark with age rising from a base sunk into the ground. Ranger was pressing close to it, his nose moving rapidly along the right side, and then he stepped back and pressed his paw against the wood. Then he looked at Claire. She brought the flashlight close. At first she saw only grain and age. The wood was dry and dark, split along its natural lines in several places, the surface rough and irregular in the way of old timber that has been through many winters. Then she saw the line. It ran vertically, almost imperceptible along the right side of the pillar. Not a split, too straight for that, too deliberate. She traced it with her finger and felt the slight give of a seam that had been fitted rather than formed. She crouched down. At the base of the pillar, half buried in the dirt and covered in a layer of old paint that had dried a long time ago, and flaked at her touch, was a metal latch. Small, made to be invisible. She took out her pocket knife and worked the edge under it carefully. The paint gave, the latch moved, and with a dry sound that carried through the cold barn like a last breath, a panel in the side of the pillar shifted and swung inward on a concealed hinge, revealing a narrow hollow space carved into the interior of the beam. Claire held the light steady. Ranger sat beside her, completely still, his amber eyes on the space inside, and he made no sound at all. Not satisfaction, not excitement. Just the quiet of a working dog that has located exactly what it was looking for. Inside the compartment, wrapped carefully in oilcloth that had been tied with cord and then tied again, were several objects. Flat packages, different sizes. And resting against the back of the hollow, its casing worn and its paint faded from dark green to something closer to gray, was a military radio unit. Compact. Old. The design placed it somewhere in the latter decades of the Cold War, the era of things built to last in conditions that weren't expected to be comfortable. Claire lifted it out first and set it carefully on an old crate beside the pillar. Then she unwrapped the oilcloth packages one at a time, working slowly, her flashlight held in her teeth. Two notebooks bound in dark leather, the cover soft with handling. She opened the first to the title page, and there, in handwriting that was careful and deliberate and a little stiff in the way of someone who had learned to print before they learned to write, was a name: Earl Harmon. She turned to the first entry, then the second package. A topographic map of the surrounding county folded precisely along its original creases. Several locations had been marked with red circles. One sat directly over the ranch property. Another, about 3 miles to the west, had a red circle and two words written beside it in the same careful hand: Old Relay Point. Below that, underlined twice, Never Fully Pulled. Claire gathered everything carefully and carried it back across the frozen yard to the farmhouse, Ranger moving beside her in the dark. She set the notebooks, the map, and the old radio on the kitchen table and sat down with them in the warmth of the wood stove, and she did not sleep again that night. Earl Harmon had not been a man of many words even on paper. His entries were short, precise, written in the measured cadence of someone who understood that clarity mattered more than eloquence, that a fact recorded cleanly was worth more than a paragraph of impression. The first notebook began 7 years earlier. The early entries were observational. Dates, times, descriptions of vehicles that had no business being on the dirt road that ran along the western edge of the property. A white utility truck, no markings, parked near the base of the ridge for 3 hours on a Tuesday afternoon. Two men with surveying equipment working the hillside above the old fence line at dusk, moving quickly, gone before dark. A set of tire tracks in the mud that led off the road and toward the relay field, and then turned around and came back, but slowly, as if whoever was driving had stopped somewhere in between. Earl had noted all of it without visible alarm in the early pages. Matter of fact, watchful. The writing of a man who had learned patience through years of living alone in a place where the nearest neighbor was 20 minutes away and the nearest town offered limited use. But as the notebooks progressed, the tone shifted, slowly and then more noticeably. By the third year, Earl was writing about Langston. He didn't have the name at first. He referred to him as the man in the dark coat, described his vehicle, his manner, the quality of his smile. The first approach had been friendly, Earl wrote, almost neighborly, an offer framed as an opportunity. When Earl had declined, the man had left without visible disappointment, which Earl noted was itself a kind of information. Men who accept a first refusal without reaction are not men who consider themselves refused. The second visit had come 14 months later. Different name on the card, different company, same man. Earl had written one sentence after that second visit alone on its page, underlined once. He knows what's under the ridge. He just doesn't know that I know he knows. Claire read that line 3 times. She turned to the back half of the second notebook where the entries became more technical. Earl had been doing his own research in the years between visits, county records, old federal surveys from the 1960s, a correspondence referenced but not reproduced with someone he called only HG, who had apparently worked for a federal infrastructure division for many years, and who had at some point before his death told Earl something specific about the land beneath Harmon Ridge. HG had said that the relay point in the western field was not decommissioned the way the federal paperwork suggested it was. The cable route that ran through this corridor of Montana, part of a Cold War communications network connecting strategic installations across the northern tier of the country, had been formally removed from service in the late 1980s. But formally removed from service and physically removed were not the same thing. The cable was still there. The relay infrastructure was still there. And according to HG, with modern signal technology, that buried network could be accessed, amplified, and used for data transmission entirely outside the channels that any federal communications authority would think to monitor. Claire set the notebook down and looked at the wall. She thought about the white utility trucks, the surveying equipment at dusk. 3 visits from the same man under 3 different names over 4 years. She thought about $22,000 offered for land that sat above something worth considerably more than $22,000. She made coffee on the old propane stove because sleep was no longer a consideration, and she stood at the kitchen window, watching the ridge in the pre-dawn dark while the water heated. The hill was a black shape against a slightly less black sky, patient and absolute. Ranger sat beside her feet, looking in the same direction she was looking. Earl knew, she said quietly. He knew the whole time. The dog's ear moved. She thought about the note tucked into the front cover of the first notebook, written in the same careful hand as all the others, but with a different quality to it, a slight unevenness in the letters that suggested it had been written deliberately with full awareness that it was for someone else to read. The note said, "I picked you because you're the only one in this family who understands that some things matter more than money. Don't sell. Don't let them tell you the price is fair. It isn't." Claire had read it once at the kitchen table and set it down without responding. She read it again now in her memory and felt something move through her chest that she didn't immediately have a name for. Not sentiment exactly, more like the recognition of being trusted with something real. Dawn came in cold and pale, and with it came Ruth Grady. Claire heard the truck before she saw it, a reliable older model with a diesel rattle that announced itself honestly across the frozen yard. She stepped onto the porch with her coffee and watched a woman climb out with the economy of movement that belongs to people who have been getting in and out of trucks in Montana winterers for the better part of 7 decades. Ruth Grady was 68, perhaps a year or two either side, with white hair pulled back cleanly and a face that had been shaped by weather and time into something angular and composed. She moved with the directness of a woman who had at some point a long time ago stopped spending any energy on hesitation. She carried a wooden box under one arm, medium-sized, sealed with a simple latch. She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked at Claire with the steady appraisal of someone who has been waiting for this moment for a while and wants to make sure they're getting a good look at it. "You found the pillar," Ruth said. It wasn't a question. "Last night," Claire said. "Ranger found it, I just followed." Ruth looked at the dog who was standing just behind Claire's left knee. Something in her expression softened slightly. "Earl talked about that dog," she said. "Said he'd find it before you did." Claire absorbed this. "You knew my uncle well." "Well enough." Ruth came up the steps and Claire opened the door and they went inside. Ruth set the wooden box on the table beside the notebooks with a careful solidity, the way you set down something you've been responsible for a long time and are only now releasing. She sat in one of the 2 chairs without being invited, the comfortable ease of someone who had sat in it before. "My husband was Harold Grady," Ruth said. "He worked for a federal infrastructure division for 31 years. Communications engineering. He was on the crew that laid the cable through this corridor in 1968. Harold was 16 years older than me, already deep into his career when we married. He knew things that he'd been asked to forget, and he mostly had, but he didn't like what he was hearing in the last years before he died." Claire sat down across from her. What was he hearing? Ruth looked at the wooden box before she answered, choosing her words with the same precision her husband must have used in his technical notes. That certain people were looking at the old Cold War infrastructure with new eyes. That the cable routes still existed underground through several states. That someone with the right equipment and the wrong intentions could access that network and use it in ways the people who built it never intended. She folded her hands on the table. Harold told Earl because Earl was the landowner above the relay point. He thought Earl deserved to know what was under his property. He didn't expect Earl to spend the next 8 years doing something about it. Earl asked my permission to mount 2 cameras on the outer fence posts, facing the yard and the barn approach. I said yes. We both knew something was coming, eventually. She opened the box. Inside were documents organized with the same deliberate care as the notebooks. Survey records, handwritten technical notes in a different hand than Earl's older and more precise the writing of an engineer. A series of photographs, black and white, showing ground-level features of the western field, taken from different angles across what appeared to be several years. And at the bottom of the box, a small voice recorder, the handheld kind, with a single cassette tape inside it. Ruth pushed it gently toward Claire. "He recorded that 2 months before he passed," Ruth said. "Said if the right person came, I'd know it, and I should give it to them." Claire picked it up and pressed play. Earl Harmon's voice came out of the small speaker and it was not what she expected. She had built a mental image of him from the brief memory of a single meeting and the careful, measured prose of the notebooks. The voice was rougher than she'd imagined, carrying the slight unevenness of age and something that might have been fatigue or might have been simply the accumulated weight of years spent watching and waiting. But it was clear. He said her name first. Then he said Victor Langston's name, slowly, followed by a company name, a second company name, and a third one that Claire hadn't heard before. He said the dates of each visit. He described each conversation with the same precise economy of the notebooks, every detail placed cleanly. Then he described how Langston had found out Claire was at the ranch so quickly the man had someone stationed in Red Creek watching the property's legal records, waiting for any change in ownership to be filed. The moment the attorney's paperwork went through, Langston had known within hours. Then Earl said the relay point is not dormant. I've confirmed it. Someone has already accessed it, and the signal it's carrying is not from any system that I can identify as legitimate. Whatever they're moving through that cable, they started moving it before they ever came to talk to me about buying the land. Claire stopped breathing for a moment. Earl's voice continued. They came to buy the property because they needed clear access to the relay junction. Right now, they're working around the boundary, but there's a maintenance point under the ridge that they can't reach without crossing onto this land. That's what they need. That's the only thing they've ever needed. He paused. The tape hissed softly. Don't sell Claire. I know what I'm asking. I know you've got nothing right now, and $22,000 probably looks like a way out. It isn't. It's a door closing. Stay. Find out what they're actually doing under that ground. And when you have enough to take to someone with federal jurisdiction, take it all at once. Don't give them pieces. Give them everything together. The tape ended. The kitchen was quiet. The stove ticked. Ranger had moved to sit beside Claire's chair at some point during the recording, and she became aware of his weight against her leg only after the silence started. Ruth was watching her with the patience of someone who has delivered difficult news before and understands that the right response to it is to give the other person room. 3 miles west, Claire said finally. Ruth nodded. He marked it on the map. Claire stood. The relay point. He marked a spot 3 miles west. Harold called it the old junction, Ruth said. There's a structure out there, or there was, an equipment shed from the original installation. It was supposed to have been demolished in the decommissioning, but the paperwork was filed before the work was done. One of those things that falls through in a bureaucracy and nobody follows up on. Claire looked at the window. The morning was clear, the sky a hard pale blue above the ridge, the plains stretching west in long frozen waves. I need to see it, she said. She left Ranger inside with Ruth, which the dog accepted with visible disapproval, and she drove the truck as far as the old fence line before the terrain forced her to continue on foot. The ground was frozen hard under a thin crust of snow that had drifted and packed along the low contours of the land, and the walking was slow but solid. The wind was behind her, which helped. She found the structure at the base of a shallow draw, mostly hidden by a decade of scrub growth, and the natural camouflage of an unpainted metal roof gone the same color as the winter grass. It was small, maybe 20 feet on a side, with the look of something built to be functional rather than noticed. The door was not padlocked. That was the first thing that registered as wrong. A structure sitting on private land in the middle of a field with no visible path leading to it that would explain regular visits should not have a door left casually unlocked unless someone intended to come back soon and didn't want the delay. Claire pushed it open. The interior was not an abandoned equipment shed. Along the right wall, racked on metal shelving, installed recently enough that the bolts were still clean, was signal equipment. A receiver unit, the casing marked with manufacturer information that put it well within the current decade. A transmission array, compact and deliberately nondescript. Cable connections running down through a sealed conduit in the concrete floor leading, she understood now, with complete certainty, directly into the relay infrastructure below. A small monitoring unit on the shelf beside the receiver showed a steady green indicator light. The equipment was running. Right now, in a shed on her land through a cable under her ground, something was being transmitted. Something that Earl had spent the last years of his life documenting and waiting for the right moment to expose. Claire stood in the middle of the shed for a long moment looking at the green light. She took photographs with the small camera she'd found in the farmhouse that morning and pocketed before leaving an old habit from years of security work, where documentation preceded everything else. She photographed the equipment, the cable conduit, the manufacturer markings, the receiver unit, the access door in its unlocked state. Then she walked back across the frozen field to the truck. Langston came back the next morning. He was not alone this time. The second man who stepped out of the SUV was older, closer to 60, heavy through the shoulders and chest, with a round face and the tired eyes of someone who spends most of his life in offices and has long since made his peace with it. He wore an expensive coat that was wrong for the weather in the way that expensive things bought without practical knowledge are often wrong. His name, Langston introduced him, was Frank Caldwell. Caldwell said nothing during the introduction. He was looking at the ranch with an assessing expression, moving his gaze across the structures, the yard, the hill behind the barn. The look of a man calculating the value of something he expects to own. Claire stood at the porch rail with her coffee ranger positioned at her left side. The dog was still this morning. No growling, just that quality of motionless attention that was in its own way more communicating than any noise. Langston's smile was as practiced as always, but something in the calibration had shifted, as if a variable had changed overnight and the smile had been adjusted to account for it. "Miss Harmon," he said, "we wanted to come back with a more serious offer, reflecting our genuine interest in the property." "Go ahead," Claire said. $55,000. Langston said it with the same composed delivery as before. Caldwell's eyes moved to Claire, watching for the reaction. Claire thought about the green light on the receiver unit in the shed, about the cable running down through the conduit into the ground beneath this property, about Earl's voice on the tape, careful and tired and absolutely clear. "No," she said. Langston's smile held, but the warmth behind it stepped back and something cooler and more functional took its place, just briefly, just enough to be visible to someone paying attention. "Miss Harmon, I want to be straightforward with you," he said. "This corridor of Montana is going to see significant development in the coming years. Properties in this area will become considerably more complicated to sell as that process moves forward. What we're offering now represents a clean exit from a property that requires considerable investment to make viable at a price that reflects our good faith." "I appreciate that," Claire said. "The answer is still no." Caldwell spoke for the first time. His voice was even and dry. "You may want to think carefully about this. Inherited properties in undeveloped areas can become more trouble than they're worth for someone without the resources or experience to manage them." "I managed 12 years in the Navy," Claire said. "I think I can handle a fence line." Something moved through Caldwell's expression, not anger, something colder and more deliberate than anger. Langston stepped in smoothly. "Of course, take whatever time you need." He produced another card and set it on the rail post as he had before. "We'll check in again soon." They drove away. Claire stood on the porch with her coffee going cold and watched the SUV until it disappeared, and she thought about the phrase "check in again soon" and the way Caldwell's eyes had moved across the property before he got back in the vehicle. Not the eyes of a man who had accepted a refusal, the eyes of a man revising his approach. She went inside and picked up the first notebook and turned to the last entry Earl had made 3 weeks before he passed. It was short, 4 sentences. They stopped coming to talk. 3 weeks ago, the white truck was back on the road at night. I heard equipment running in the western field at 2 in the morning, and it stopped before I could get to the window. Whatever they're doing, they've moved past negotiating. Claire closed the notebook. She looked at Ranger, who was watching her from his position near the stove. She picked up her coat. She drove into Red Creek and found Amos Pruitt not at the diner, but at the general store, examining a display of weatherproofing supplies with the careful attention of a man who had learned not to trust packaging claims. She told him what she'd found in the shed, what the tape had said, what was running through the cable beneath the ground. She told him all of it clearly, without embellishment, the way Earl had written in his notebooks. Amos listened without interrupting. When she finished, he put down the weatherproofing compound he'd been holding and looked at her with the same steady blue eyes she'd seen across the diner counter. Ruth already called me this morning," he said, "after you went out to the shed." "She did. Woman's been waiting 8 years for someone to show up with enough to act on." He picked up the weatherproofing compound and put it in his basket. "I know who to call. Spent 15 years doing county administration before I retired. I know which federal channel handles infrastructure violations, and I know how to put information in front of the right person so it doesn't get filed somewhere and forgotten. He looked at her. You have everything documented. Photographs, Earl's notebooks, the tape, Ruth's box of materials. He nodded slowly. Then you have enough. She drove back to the ranch in the late afternoon with the sky going orange and crimson over the ridge, the kind of Montana sunset that seemed almost deliberately excessive, and the shadows of the fence posts stretched long across the frozen ground ahead of her. She stacked the notebooks on the shelf beside the stove, where she could see them from anywhere in the room. Set the wooden box on the kitchen table, rolled the topographic map, and leaned it against the wall beside the door. Placed the voice recorder on top of the box, everything accounted for. Everything in the warmth of the farmhouse off the frozen ground and out of the barn. Ranger was watching the ridge from the passenger seat on the drive back, his nose at the window crack, his ears fully forward. He had found the pillar. He had found the compartment. He had been the first one to know there was something to find in the way that certain animals know things before the evidence has fully assembled itself into something visible. She reached over and pressed her hand briefly to the top of his head. He leaned into it without looking away from the ridge. Whatever was coming, they were as ready as they were going to be. And the night was settling in over Harmon Ridge, deep and cold, and full of the silence of a place that has been holding a secret for a very long time and has not yet decided to let it go. The fire started at 2 in the morning. Ranger heard it first the way he heard everything first, before it had fully become a sound that a human ear would register as significant. He was on his feet before Claire had fully surfaced from sleep, and his bark was not the bark of an animal responding to something unfamiliar. It was the bark of an animal responding to something confirmed, something he had been waiting for without knowing exactly when it would arrive. Claire was at the window in 4 seconds. The barn was lit from inside, orange light pressing through every gap in the old boards, through the loose panels, through the spaces where the roof met the walls imperfectly. Not the warm, contained light of something controlled. The spreading, climbing light of something that had already made up its mind. She pulled her boots on and her coat over the clothes she'd slept in, and she was through the door before the second thought formed. The cold hit her like a wall. The night was clear and still no wind for once, which meant the smoke was rising straight up in a column that would be visible for miles in the morning light. But morning was hours away and the barn was burning now. Ranger ran ahead of her toward the barn door, and for 1 second Claire thought he was going in, and she reached for his collar to pull him back. But he stopped at the threshold. He stood there in the orange light, with the heat pushing against his face, and he turned and looked at her, and his eyes said what they always said. I've checked. There's nothing in there worth our lives. She understood. Everything that mattered was behind her inside the farmhouse. The notebook stacked by the stove, the wooden box on the table, the map leaning against the wall beside the door, the voice recorder sitting on top of the box. Earl had built his archive for exactly this kind of night, and she had kept it exactly where it needed to be. She stood beside Ranger and watched the barn burn. It was burning in earnest now, the old dry timber taking the fire completely, the roof beginning to show through in orange shapes as the panels gave way. There was nothing to do about the barn itself. The well was hand-pumped and slow, and she had no equipment, and the nearest fire station was 30 minutes away across frozen roads. She stood and watched it go, the heat reaching her across the yard with something almost like warmth, which in a different context would have been welcome. She was thinking about the angle of the fire's starting point, the rear left corner, the location least visible from the farmhouse windows. No wind had moved through the loose panels tonight, which meant no ember had found old hay by accident. Someone had crossed the yard in the clear, still night and done a deliberate thing. She was also thinking about Ruth's cameras. Claire went inside and called her. The phone rang 4 times before Ruth answered, her voice carrying no trace of sleep, as if she'd been awake already. The barn, Claire said. I saw it on the monitor, Ruth said. Both cameras triggered at 1:47. I have the footage. All of it. Everything from the moment someone came over the south fence to the moment the fire started. There are 2 of them. I can see their faces clearly enough. The light from the fire helps considerably. Claire stood at the kitchen window watching the barn collapse inward, section by section, the light dropping as the fuel consumed itself. She looked at the notebooks on the shelf, at the box on the table, at the map against the wall, all of it intact, all of it safe. "I'm calling Amos in the morning," she said. "I already called him," Ruth said. "He's contacting the Federal Infrastructure Office when they open. He said to tell you he wants the notebooks, the tape, my documentation, and the camera footage all submitted together. Not separately, together." That's what Earl said on the tape. "Earl said it to Harold first," Ruth said. "Harold said it came from 30 years of watching things get lost in bureaucracies. Give them everything at once, and they can't misplace any of it." "Good boy," Claire said quietly, looking at Ranger, where he lay near the door, his chin on his front paws, his amber eyes steady on her face. His tail moved once against the floor. Agent Dex Calloway arrived at Harmon Ridge 2 days later in a dark government vehicle that was practical rather than impressive, followed by a second vehicle carrying 3 technicians with equipment cases. Calloway was in his mid-40s with close-cropped sandy hair and the measured, unhurried bearing of a man who had learned to project calm in situations designed to produce the opposite. He wore a standard federal field jacket and practical boots and carried a notepad in his left hand with the unself-conscious ease of someone for whom documentation was not a secondary concern but a primary tool. He introduced himself clearly, showed his credentials without being asked, looked at Claire with the level attention of a man making an initial assessment and keeping his conclusions to himself. Ranger regarded him from the porch. Calloway looked at the dog. Military working dog. "Retired," Claire said. "With my Navy." Calloway nodded at the burned outline where the barn had stood. "He get everyone out." "He told me there was nothing in there worth going in for," Claire said. "He was right." Calloway made a note, not performatively, just writing down what was relevant. They sat at the kitchen table and Claire laid out everything in the order Earl's tape had specified. The notebooks first opened to the key entries. The topographic map unrolled and held flat by the coffee mugs. The wooden box with Harold Grady's technical notes and survey records. The voice recorder with Earl's cassette, which Calloway listened to in full. Without expression, the small speaker filling the kitchen with the old rancher's measured, exhausted, absolutely precise voice. Then Ruth's camera footage on the laptop Ruth had brought with her, arriving at the ranch 20 minutes after Calloway, standing at the kitchen counter, with her coat still on and her arms folded as she pulled up the files. Calloway watched the footage twice. The second time he paused it at a specific frame and leaned closer to the screen. "Clear enough," he said. His technicians had already been deployed to the western field, following the coordinates from Earl's map to the equipment shed. They were out there now with ground-penetrating scanning equipment visible from the kitchen window as small figures moving methodically across the frozen grass. Amos Pruitt sat at the table's end with the patience of a man who has waited a long time for a particular meeting to occur and is now simply allowing it to unfold. He had brought the county administration records he'd referenced establishing the chain of land ownership and the original federal permits issued for the cable installation in 1968. Ruth had brought a document she hadn't mentioned before. A letter Harold had written to a federal communications oversight office in the last year of his life, describing his concerns about the Cold War infrastructure and the lack of genuine decommissioning. The letter had received a form response acknowledging receipt and had gone no further. Harold had kept his copy. Ruth had kept Harold's copy. Calloway read the letter and set it beside the notebooks without comment, but he wrote something on his notepad and underlined it twice. One of the technicians appeared at the kitchen door. "Sir, we've got the junction point. The relay infrastructure is intact and there's an active signal running through it. We've identified the access conduit from the structure in the western field." Calloway set his pen down. "Active signal. Running now, continuous transmission. It's not using any frequency allocation we can find on any registered civilian or commercial license in this region." The kitchen went quiet for a moment. Calloway looked at Claire, then at the notebooks on the table, then at the voice recorder beside them. "Your uncle documented nearly 8 years of approach and surveillance by these individuals," he said. 8 years, Claire confirmed, alone without anyone to hand it off to until now. Calloway picked up the voice recorder and turned it in his hands. He was protecting federal infrastructure from unauthorized private access. It wasn't quite a question. He was doing what he thought needed doing, Claire said, because nobody else was. Calloway set the recorder down with something that, in a man with a more expressive face, might have been respect. He made 2 calls from the porch in the cold morning air, speaking in the low, efficient manner of someone transmitting coordinates rather than having a conversation. When he came back inside, he told Claire that federal warrants were being processed for the arrest of Victor Langston and Frank Caldwell on charges related to unauthorized access to federal communications infrastructure, and that Ruth's camera footage was being added to an arson investigation already in progress. He said it all in the same measured tone he'd used for everything else. "How long has the cable been accessed?" Claire asked. "Preliminary read from my technicians suggests at least 2 years of continuous use," Calloway said. "Possibly longer. The equipment in the read shows installation of work at 2 different periods, original and then upgraded. These weren't people who wanted to buy the land to develop it. They needed the maintenance junction on this property to keep the relay operational. Without access to that junction, the connection degrades. They've been trying to acquire it for years." Claire thought about Earl's voice on the tape. About 8 years of refusing. 8 years alone on this ridge, watching the white trucks and the survey equipment and the men with their polished shoes and their changing company names and their escalating offers. Not moving, not once. She looked out the window at the burned footprint where the barn had stood. They had burned it because she hadn't moved either. She supposed that was the point. Victor Langston was taken into custody at a hotel in Billings that same afternoon. Frank Caldwell was located at a rental property outside Missoula the following morning. Claire learned this from Calloway, who called her from wherever he was with the same efficiency he brought to everything, relaying information the way a person relays facts rather than news. She was standing on the porch when the call came. Ranger beside her, both of them looking out at the ridge in the pale winter afternoon light. The sky was a hard, clean blue, and the plains stretched west in long waves of frozen grass, and the burned outline of the barn sat on the left edge of her vision, the dark scar of it settling into the frozen ground. 3 weeks later, Calloway returned to Harmon Ridge with a different kind of paperwork. He sat at the same table and explained in the same measured way that the Federal Communications Division had determined that the relay junction on the Harmon Ridge property was a point of strategic interest for the rebuilt monitoring network they were in the process of establishing across the region. They were not in the business of acquiring land through anything other than willing agreement. What they were proposing was a long-term lease arrangement for a small section of the western field, enough to establish a proper monitoring station with legal access to the relay infrastructure below. He named an annual figure. It was not $22,000. It was not $55,000. It was a number that sat in the kitchen of the old farmhouse with the quiet, solid presence of something that changes the shape of a life without requiring any drama to do it. Claire looked at the paperwork for a long moment. She thought about the 93 days she'd spent going nowhere, about the truck and the gravel lot and the cold, about the index card Amos had pressed into her hands in the diner. Don't sell, trust the dog. She thought about Earl in his chair at this table in the winter light, writing in the notebooks that nobody was supposed to see until the right person arrived. She thought about Ranger finding the pillar. She signed the paperwork. Spring arrived in Montana with the gradual seriousness of something that means to stay. The snow retreated from the lower fields, first pulling back toward the ridge over the course of 2 weeks in late March, leaving behind ground that was dark and saturated and ready. The sky opened up from the low iron press of winter into something wider, shifting across the day from pale morning blue to high midday brightness to the long gold and crimson that came in from the west every evening. The barn was rebuilt. Not the same barn. A better one with good lumber and proper ventilation and a roof that wouldn't accumulate snow in ways that put pressure on the joints. The federal monitoring station appeared in the western field, a small and deliberately unobtrusive structure that 3 technicians maintained on a rotating schedule, coming and going, without drama, nodding to Claire when they passed and leaving the rest of the property entirely alone. The sheep came back in April, 8 of them to start purchase with the first lease payment from a rancher 2 counties east. They moved through the new pasture grass with the unhurried, slightly skeptical manner of animals who have learned not to invest too quickly in any new arrangement. Ranger watched them from the fence line with profound professional interest. Ruth Grady came by twice a week without being asked. She had decided, apparently without needing to announce it, that Harmon Ridge was a place where her presence was useful, and she intended to continue providing it. She brought practical things: canning supplies, seed packets, a book on sheep husbandry left on the kitchen table without comment. She drank coffee and talked about Harold in the same matter-of-fact way she talked about everything else, the way of a woman who has made her peace with loss by keeping the memory in active use. Amos Pruitt came less frequently, but with greater deliberateness, always calling ahead, always arriving with something specific to discuss. The county administration angle of the federal case. The paperwork trail that Harold's letter had created decades earlier, and that had now become a central piece of the prosecution's documentation. He brought the same careful, organized approach to all of it that he brought to everything, the habits of 15 years in county government, still fully operative in retirement. Claire built the program in the spare time that began to accumulate as the ranch found its rhythm. It had started as an idea during the worst of the winter, lying awake in Earl's chair with the notebooks in her lap, thinking about what the ranch could be beyond what it already was. It had become something more concrete in the weeks after Calloway's second visit, when the shape of the future had clarified enough to plan against. The program was simple in concept: a place at Harmon Ridge for veterans transitioning out of service who had worked with military dogs and for the dogs themselves when they were retired. A structured environment where the skills that didn't transfer easily to civilian life, the discipline, the situational awareness, the capacity for mission-focused work, could be applied to something real and physical and ongoing. Fence work and animal care, and the grounding that comes from land which needs attention and responds to it honestly. She called it the Ridge Program because simplicity seemed appropriate. The first two participants arrived in May. A man named Garrett, 38, 4 years Army, with a military working dog background, who had been trying to find his footing in civilian life for 8 months with limited success. And his dog, a Belgian Malinois named Colt, retired due to a hip condition, who regarded the Montana landscape with the wide-eyed intensity of an animal encountering a new operational environment and finding it larger than expected. Ranger received them both at the gate. He greeted Garrett with the careful, measured friendliness of an experienced dog who understood that new arrivals needed assessment before trust, and he greeted Colt with the directness of a working dog meeting, another working mount, a brief and efficient exchange that established everything necessary and required no further elaboration. Garrett stood in the yard of Harmon Ridge Ranch on a May morning with the plains spreading out around him and the ridge rising behind the new barn and the sheep moving in the lower pasture, and he looked at all of it for a long moment. "Good land," he said finally. "It's a lot of work," Claire said. "Good my bed," Garrett said. By summer, there were 4 veterans at the Ridge. By fall, 6. Word moved through networks that didn't require advertising, through the reliable channel of people telling other people about a place that had done something real for someone they trusted. The federal case moved forward on its own schedule. Claire gave her testimony in August in a conference room in Billings with a stenographer and 2 federal attorneys in Callaway sitting at the side table taking notes. She laid out the sequence of events in the same order Earl had established in the notebooks, because his sequence was better than anything she would have organized on her own. The notebooks were entered into evidence. The tape was entered into evidence. Ruth's camera footage was entered into evidence. Harold Grady's 30-year-old letter to the Oversight Office was entered into evidence, the longest thread in a chain that had finally found its end. On a Wednesday in October, Calloway called Claire and told her the verdicts. She was standing at the fence line watching the sheep when the call came in. Ranger was beside her, sitting in the dried autumn grass, his face turned toward the western field, where the small monitoring station sat quiet in the afternoon light. She thanked Calloway and put the phone in her coat pocket and stood for a while looking at the ridge. Earl had watched this same ridge for 8 years alone, writing in his notebooks, refusing every offer, waiting for something or someone that could carry what he'd been carrying and take it further than he could. He had tracked Claire down through the precision of a man who plans for contingencies, had briefed Amos Pruitt, had timed a handwritten card, had described a beat-up blue Ford from memory months before he passed. He had not left things to chance because he understood that the things worth protecting rarely survive chance alone. She understood standing there that what he'd really been protecting wasn't just the cable or the infrastructure or the legal designation of what lay beneath the ground. Those things mattered. But underneath all of it, he had been protecting the possibility of what the land could become in the right hands. A ranch that worked. A place that helped people find their footing again. The kind of thing that a piece of ground can hold quietly for as long as it takes the right person to arrive and understand it. Ranger stood and pressed against her leg. She reached down and put her hand on the back of his neck, the thick, warm fur of him, the solid, familiar weight of his attention moving through her palm. He had found the pillar. He had found the compartment in the cold and the dark while she was still thinking about selling and moving on. He had stood at the threshold of the burning barn and told her in the only language available to him that everything worth saving was already safe. He had been the first to understand, in the way that certain animals understand things before the evidence has finished assembling itself, that this place was worth something that couldn't be expressed in the numbers Langston had carried in his thin leather folder. The afternoon light came in low across the Montana plains, catching the dry autumn grass and turning it briefly gold. The sheep moved below in the slow, deliberate patterns of animals with no agenda but the next moment. From the new barn, she could hear Garrett working on something, a steady, measured sound that suggested a man who had found a rhythm and was keeping to it. Harmon Ridge Ranch sat under the wide October sky and held everything. It held the people and the animals and the old cable running under the ridge and the new barn and the burned outline still faintly visible in the ground where the old one had stood. And all of it together formed something that had a name now, even if the name was just the name of the place itself. Claire stayed at the fence line until the light changed Ranger beside her, both of them watching the long shadows of evening move across the land that Earl Harmon had kept all those years for exactly this.